Hey, tonight we're going to drift back in time to a world of wooden carts, smoky thatch roof cottages, and the slightly alarming scent of boiled turnips. A world where your entire village might rise up in bloody rebellion, not over freedom or abstract rights, but because the local law doubled your oat tax or banned your community bread oven. Yep, Peasant Revolts. You've probably heard about them, maybe the famous ones like the Peasants' Revolt in England or the Jacquerie in France. But the truth is, across medieval Europe, the soil was thick with the trampled hopes of angry farmers, disillusioned herders, and tired serfs wielding pitchforks with slightly more energy than usual. Tonight, you'll walk beside them. We'll follow rusted armour clanking through Flemish streets. We'll climb the muddy hill paths of Bohemia as barefoot rebels whisper oaths by torchlight. We'll pause beneath the shadow of a collapsing manor house in 1328, its walls still smouldering from a peasant fire, and listen to the silence that follows a failed uprising. And while it's tempting to picture these events as loud, chaotic, and full of drama, the truth is far stranger, quieter, and in many ways, sleepier. Many revolts were born not from heroic speeches, but from tax rolls, or bad weather, or the rumour that your landlord was about to invent a new kind of punishment involving sheep dung and rope. We'll explore how revolts really began, not with swords but with soup bowls emptied too many times, and how they usually ended, with some nobleman's head still firmly attached to his body, and your cousin Jakob mysteriously vanishing after talking too much in the tavern. So dim the lights, loosen your grip on reality. Let your mind stroll through ancient fields between hedgerows grown thick with resentment and rest in a world where justice was measured with a rusted scale and sometimes thrown into the end. Erest well, oh. And if you're enjoying these strange, sleep-friendly trips through history, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. I'm always curious where folks are listening from. Drop a comment with your location and the time it is where you are. For me, it's just past midnight, and I'm lighting a candle in a mental tavern in Yorkshire. Let's drift back, together, and see what happens when the bottom of society decides it's had just about enough porridge. You're standing in a muddy village square in Norfolk, England, in the spring of 1381. Chickens scratch idly near your feet, and the faint smell of boiled onions drifts from a nearby cottage. You shift your weight, trying to keep your wooden shoes from sinking further into the sludge. A hush spreads. The king's tax collectors have arrived. They're not particularly intimidating, middle-aged men in travel-stained wool, one with a noticeable limp, another with ink-stained fingers. But they carry the authority of the crown. And they carry parchments, long, curling lists with names, numbers, and cruel little notes. This year, there's a new head tax. Every adult must pay regardless of income. For you, it's the third time in 4 years. You're expected to pay the same as the Reeve's daughter, who owns 2 cows and a copper kettle. You stand in line, clutching a few worn coins and trying to look cooperative. The man ahead of you whispers something unwise and is promptly struck across the ear. The tax man doesn't even raise his voice, just jots something extra in the margin. Later that week, rumours spread. In Essex, a man named Thomas Baker refused to pay and chased the collectors off with a hoe. In Kent, villagers attacked the manor house and burned the rolls. You sit near the hearth that night listening. Someone mentions a preacher named John Ball saying, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" A strange silence follows. By morning, there's a new energy in the village, not hopeful, just taut, like something stretched too far for too long. The collectors will return, but you can already sense, next time, they may not leave in one piece. You walk along a quiet field outside Meaux, France, in the year 1358. It's dawn. A thin mist lingers across the tilled earth, and distant roosters crow with little enthusiasm. A group of peasants, farmers, tanners, brewers, stands around a crude wooden post. They've just finished constructing an effigy of a nobleman, complete with a rag-stuffed doublet and a painted sneer. One man hands you a turnip carved into a crude crown. You place it carefully on the effigy's straw head, then you cut it off. This is the Jacquerie, a spontaneous revolt. No single leader, no master plan, just raw anger from years of being trampled, taxed and tormented by lords who fled when the English invaded and returned only to demand more. Your fields were burned, your livestock stolen by both sides of the war, and now they ask for grain to pay for new armour. The peasants marched from village to village, pulling nobles from their manors, destroying ledgers, looting cellars. It's not glorious. The wine is sour, the parchment doesn't burn well, and the horses refuse to cooperate. And when the royal army arrives, mercenaries in polished armour, you scatter like mice. The reprisals are swift. Hundreds are executed. Back in Mo, the effigy lies in the mud, crown askew. A child picks it up, dusts it off and places it on his own head. He giggles. No one tells him to stop. You duck inside a candlemaker's shop in Prague, 1419. The air smells like beeswax and singed wool. At the back, beneath shelves of dripping tapers, a quiet sermon is being whispered. A few cobblers and washerwomen nod solemnly. The man preaching is no priest, just a journeyman named Jan. He speaks of the Hussites. He speaks of justice, equality, and the divine absurdity that priests eat roast pork while peasants chew on bark. He calls for change, not in heaven, but here. Now. You leave the shop with a pamphlet hidden in your boot and a strange lightness in your chest. Within weeks, the city is in revolt. Townspeople storm the town hall and hurl corrupt officials from the windows. They float down into a pile of spears. It's called defenestration, and it becomes oddly popular in Bohemia. The nobles flee, radical priests take over the pulpits, songs are sung in Czech instead of Latin, peasants march under banners stitched by candlelight, declaring God is on their side, because surely he's not with the landlords. But it grows dark quickly. The church brands them heretics. Armies are sent. You hide your pamphlet, burn your banner. But the smell of beeswax lingers on your clothes. You're seated at a rough-hewn table in Ghent, Flanders, sometime around 1302. The beer is weak, the bread is stale, and the innkeeper looks suspicious of everyone. But there's something stirring tonight. The weavers are angry. They've always been proud, independent craftsmen with guilds, apprentices and rules. But the local count has sided with the French, and now new taxes are bleeding the city dry. Someone slams a tankard. Another reads a secret message from Bruges. A militia is forming. By morning the bells are ringing, workshops shut down, looms fall silent. You march through cobbled streets, past canals, under banners with lions and saints. At Courtrai, the rebels win, astonishingly. They slaughter hundreds of French knights and hang their golden spurs in a church as trophies. The revolt becomes legend, but you know the aftermath. There are reprisals. Tensions between the guilds and city elites fester. Within a decade, the count regains power. The spurs still gleam in the church, though, and sometimes when the wind shifts, you think you hear looms thundering again. You kneel beside a low hearth in a cottage outside Florence, 1378. The oven is cold, the flour sack's nearly empty. You're a wool carder, but you haven't been paid in months. The Chiompi, the labouring poor, are fed up. You gather in secret, in bakehouses and alleyways. You swear oaths over crusts of bread. The revolt begins when guards are distracted by a church procession. Workers storm the government buildings, demanding representation. For a few weeks it works. The poor control the signoria. You sit in meetings beside men who used to ignore you in the dying houses. But power doesn't sit well on calloused hands. Infighting begins. The elite regroup. Soon, your neighbours are arrested. Your baker hides his bread under floorboards. When the old regime returns, it pretends nothing happened. But your hands still remember the feel of a ballot, warm with the grease of hope. You wipe sweat from your brow as the summer sun beats down over Castile, Spain in 1521. The wheat ripples like gold across the hills. It should be a good year, but you're not smiling, because the harvest won't be yours. You've heard the word comuneros. A movement of townsfolk and smallholders rising up against King Charles I, who's off gallivanting in distant corners of his Holy Roman Empire while foreign advisors bleed Castile dry. Your lord built a new wall last winter, just to separate the grain store from the workers. He hasn't spoken to anyone in the village since. So in a low stone church you gather with others, artisans, labourers. One man with ink-stained sleeves carries a list of grievances. It's long. It includes taxes, forced loans, foreign governors, and the curious case of a local widow whose orchard was confiscated for reasons no one can explain. Then, the signal. The bells of Valladolid toll strangely. Twice, then thrice. You march. For weeks, the comuneros take towns. They wear simple clothing and speak of ancient Castilian rights. You stand beside a lawyer-turned-rebel who swears this is not revolt, it's restoration. But kings don't like being corrected. The royal army meets you near Villalar. You stand behind a makeshift barricade made of carts and barrels, gripping a pitchfork with sweaty palms. There is no strategy, just conviction, and a surprising amount of mud. It's over quickly. The leaders are executed, heads displayed. You return to the fields. The wheat still ripples, but now it whispers. You lean against a moss-covered wall in Tournai, 1486. The cathedral bell is cracked. They say it hasn't rung since the Weavers' Revolt. The city, proud and wealthy, was ruled by guilds until the merchants backed by the Duke tried to replace the old bell, claiming it was offensive to modern taste. No one bought that excuse. The bell was a symbol. It called meetings, warned of fires, marked births and deaths. To remove it was to unmoor the city's soul. You were just a child when the riot began, but you remember the clang of cobblestones thrown at guards, the red banners unfurling like wounds across rooftops, and your neighbour's tabby cat sitting calmly through it all. The Duke responded, of course, harshly. He sent in troops who smashed the guild halls and stripped weavers of their voting rights. The bell was silenced. Now, as you pass the silent tower, a pigeon coos somewhere inside. You tilt your head. For a second, you think you hear the faintest echo of bronze. Or maybe it's just your memory making music out of old grievances. You're in the damp northern lowlands of Friesland, circa 1515, in what is now the Netherlands. The sky is grey, perpetually, the ground wetter than it should be. The landlord's men just stole your turnips. Again. You didn't think it would lead to this. It started with the Black Band, German mercenaries hired by a local duke to keep order. Instead, they looted villages, assaulted farmers, and burned fields. You watch your cousin scream at a soldier for stepping on her last chicken. Then comes Pierre Gerloff's Donia, a Frisian farmer whose home is burned, wife murdered, land stolen. He doesn't deliver speeches. He swings a sword taller than most men. You find yourself among his Arumer Zwarte Hoop, or Black Army. You attack tax collectors on the road, sink ships on the Zuiderzee, burn letters sealed with noble crests. It's chaos. Glorious, smoky, muddy chaos. But it's unsustainable. Eventually, the nobility closes ranks. They call it piracy. They call you pirates. The army disperses. You return home to a hut rebuilt from scorched timber and to turnips grown from hard, quiet soil. Some rebellions don't end in revolution. They end in vegetables. You stand in a frosted pasture in 1525. The Swabian Alps loom behind you, dark and hunched like sleeping giants. You're a peasant, barely that. The priest calls your house a shed with ambitions. But what really broke you wasn't the house. It was the Zent, the tithe, 10% of everything, including, this year, cows. You only have one. Her name is Ilse. She's not very bright. When the taxmen come with their scrolls and smug expressions, your village refuses. A standoff ensues. Then a revolt. The German Peasants' War explodes across the region. It's not just about cows, it's about land, autonomy, the right to hunt, and to interpret scripture without aristocratic middlemen. You march with thousands. The 12 articles are nailed to church doors. You sleep in barns, eat stolen sausages, hear sermons under rain-dark skies. But Luther condemns you. The nobles hire mercenaries. The revolt is crushed. Your village burns. Ilsa survives, somehow. You spend the next year repairing fences and listening to new tithes being read with a slightly more cautious tone. No one mentions the cow anymore. You walk through a snowy valley near the Alps, 1492. The watermill's wheel is frozen solid. Inside it's cold, but warm bread fills the air. You're part of a movement, though you wouldn't say so aloud. They call you Poor Conrad, a loose association of millers, coopers and day labourers protesting the latest round of imperial taxes under Duke Ulrich of Württemberg. The grain measure has been secretly shrunk. Bread is smaller, beer weaker, but prices? Oh, those stay the same. You gather at mills and in forests. You sing old folk songs with slightly rewritten verses. One about a goose that steals back its feathers. Another where a duke drowns in a vat of spoiled ale. They're silly, but they're also treason. Eventually, in 1514, the dam breaks. Hundreds rise up. You seize tax houses, destroy records, blockade towns. You even demand the duke explain himself. He does, eventually, from behind a wall of armoured men. The rebellion fails. Your leaders are imprisoned, tortured, or quietly vanished. But the songs remain, passed from mill to mill, year after year. And tonight, as you sit beside the fire, you hum the tune about the goose, quietly, just in case someone's listening. You stand in Erfurt, Saxony, one bitter winter evening in 1509. The snow crunches underfoot, and your breath comes in white clouds. The church bells have stopped ringing. No one's quite sure why. The mayor has been dead for a week. Died in his sleep, they said. Peaceful, dignified. But the shoemakers don't believe it, nor do the coopers, the grain measurers, or the many, many unpaid journeymen. They say he hoarded food during the shortage last summer, hid barrels of barley under the monastery floor while children starved. So tonight you're holding a lantern, and you're following a line of solemn, angry villagers with shovels. They dig him up. The coffin is lighter than expected. Inside, he looks surprised. The kind of surprise that comes from dying with secrets. No one speaks. Someone ties a note around his neck. Here lies the hunger of Erfurt. By morning, the bishop has sent guards, but they're too late. The coffin's been reburied, quietly. The church denies everything. The streets fall silent again. But you walk a little differently now, because you've seen how deep the anger goes, and how sometimes it doesn't stay buried. You sit beside a salt pit near Lüneburg, Germany, in 1470. Your hands are cracked from brine. The salt trade is booming, just not for you. The city has a monopoly. Nobles grow fat. You grow pale. You taste salt in your bread, your sweat, your sleep. The miners mutter. Taxes rise. The council bans selling salt without permits that cost more than your monthly wage. Someone jokes about seasoning their stew with the council's bones. You don't laugh, not because it isn't funny, but because you're too tired. One night the workers march, quietly. They block the roads, overturn carts, seize storehouses. A document is nailed to the Guildhall door, the Lüneburg Oath. Demands written in shaky ink. For a few days it works. The council negotiates. Then the soldiers come. The ringleaders are hanged. The salt pit reopens. Your hands return to brine. But someone hums a tune at work, an old miner's song with new verses. One about councilmen dissolving into salt. You hum along softly. It helps. A little. You kneel in the cold stone chapel of a convent in Brabant, 1313. The ceiling drips with condensation, and the candles sputter against the damp. Famine has struck hard. Crops failed after years of wet summers. The tithe carts are still full, but yours are empty. The convent distributes bread carefully, selectively. There's a list, names allowed to eat, and those told to pray harder. You watch as Sister Margaret tucks the parchment into her sleeve. She's not supposed to question it, but last week she gave your child an extra crust. Now she's missing. Some say she fled. Others say the abbot found her in the archive, copying names into her own book. Either way, the next week the breadline shortens. No explanation. You slip inside the scriptorium one night. Pages lie torn. Ink bottles spilled. A single crust sits on the table. Someone left it, perhaps as a message or a warning, or maybe just forgot. The convent remains quiet, too quiet. You listen as your stomach growls and the bells toll vespers. Sometimes mercy disappears without a sound. You squat beneath a hay cart near the border of Flanders, 1300s. The sun is setting. The air smells of manure, damp wool, and tension. They call it sabotage, from sabot, the wooden shoe, a peasant tool, a symbol, and now a weapon. The textile mills have changed everything. Machines run faster, fewer workers are needed, and those who remain earn less. You used to weave, now you load carts. And listen, one night the sabots are thrown into gears, into axles, into the delicate throats of machines that hum like nobles in the bathhouse. The machines stop. Mill owners rage. Rewards are posted. Your neighbour is arrested. The rest of you wear your sabots proudly, though now with softer steps. The revolt never has a banner, no leader, just shoes flung in quiet defiance. Years pass. The mills recover. The wages don't. But even now, as you walk the muddy road home, you feel the weight of your shoes, not just on your feet, but in history. You sit on a creaking pew in a village church in Languedoc, France, 1437. The incense is weak, the priest's cassock mended 3 times, and the homily absent. Father Benoit stands silent before the altar. He's been that way 3 Sundays in a row. It began when a new salt tax, la gabelle, was imposed. You now pay 3 times as much for a handful of grey, dirty crystals. The king said it was to fund a campaign against the English. You haven't seen an Englishman in a decade, but you've seen your children's porridge thinning. Father Benoit refused to read the royal decree, claimed God had enough commandments. A week later, the bishop visited. The next morning, the priest's cottage was empty. The chickens were still there. His boots sat neatly by the hearth. In the church, someone has scrawled "Salt burns" on the altar in charcoal. It's scrubbed off by noon. But the pews stay mostly empty now, and when the bell rings, it sounds quieter, like it's mourning something no one dares name. You sit on a low stool in a wind-blown village in the Rhineland, 1335. It's harvest season, but the carts are slow, too many hands missing, too many debts unpaid. In the granary, the Lord Steward arrives with his measure, a wooden tub rimmed with iron designed to favour his side of the bargain. He skims the top clean each time, muttering something about tradition. But today, the steward finds the tub missing. It was Gertrude, the baker's widow. She'd hidden it in her bread oven, then quietly replaced it with a slightly larger one. By afternoon, the village is gossiping about how fair the new weight feels. No one dares praise her aloud. Within days, soldiers arrive. The steward's men drag Gertrude to the square. They call it theft. She calls it honesty. The punishment is public shame and confiscation of her flour stores. The crowd says nothing, but that night someone pours spoiled milk into the steward's boots. Someone else removes the door from his grain store. No one mentions Gertrude again, but from then on the new measure stays. You squat beneath a twisted pine near Montaillou in the Pyrenees, 1318. The wind is sharp, carrying with it the scent of damp wool and mountain thyme. The king's messengers are due to pass through, envoys collecting new census data. That means new taxes, new quotas, new men taken for war. The shepherds gather before dawn. No weapons, just their staffs and a cart full of rocks. The road is narrow. They block it with brush, dung, and a single angry goat. The messengers never arrive. Rumours say they were turned back, told of a storm or a plague or wolves. The truth never surfaces. The mountains keep secrets well. But for a few seasons, the taxes pause, the quotas stall, and the goat becomes something of a village icon. Fed scraps, never slaughtered, always watching. You pass her sometimes. She blinks slowly, as if remembering her role in a very quiet rebellion. You walk the rutted path into Todi, central Italy, 1349. The town is unusually quiet. No singing, no market hawkers. The bells haven't rung in days. A banner hangs from the well. The tax of silence has begun. The story goes like this. After plague swept through, the bishop raised levies to rebuild the town. But the town hadn't asked to be rebuilt, and the plague had already taken half the workforce. So they stopped speaking, literally. When the collectors arrived, they were greeted with bowed heads and sealed lips. No shouting, no pleas, just a population doing their work in utter, unnerving quiet. The taxmen returned confused. No one resisted, but no one cooperated either. Weeks passed, then months. Finally, the levy was withdrawn, citing spiritual unrest. You watch as a man hammers the bell again. It rings softly, as if remembering the hush. And even now, villagers still lower their voices around strangers. Old habits linger. You crouch in the shadows beneath the Charles Bridge in Prague, 1393. Above you, monks chant, merchants haggle. But down here, it's darker, wetter, quieter. The stone arch above is ancient, but the toll is new. The king wants coin for every cart that crosses, even for farmers, even for the sick. So you meet in the damp. Boatmen, porters, a few apprentice masons. Someone has forged a stamp. It makes the official seal, almost, not quite. Carts begin passing without payment. The bridge guards are confused. The paperwork all seems correct. Eventually it's discovered. One apprentice disappears. The Masons' Guild is fined, but the stamp vanishes, never found. Years later, someone claims it's buried in a wall near the old town, sealed inside a block of sandstone. You pass that wall often. Run your hand along the stone. Feel the faintest bump where truth once hid in plain sight. Sometimes resistance is not fire, but clever ink. You stand at the edge of a fortress village in Gascony, 1360. The 100 Years' War rages elsewhere, but the taxes arrive like clockwork. A steward rides in with a cart and 6 guards. He demands grain, meat, and, peculiarly, wine. The village steward is missing. So is the record book and the keys. They say a girl took them. No one saw her do it. No one saw her leave. But the gates stayed locked, and the taxmen camped outside for 2 nights before giving up. The girl never returned. Some say she crossed the mountains. Others claim she lives in the forest, feeding foxes and collecting lichen. But each year when the tax collectors approach, the keys go missing again. You glance at the gatehouse now. A small ribbon flutters from the window, tied in the same pale colour as her bonnet. You smile, faintly. Because sometimes history is rewritten not by kings or warriors, but by a quiet girl who hid a key. You stand among the barley fields of northern England, 1382. The stalks rustle softly in the evening breeze. Behind you, the manor house stands dark, its shutters drawn tight. The Lord hasn't been seen since the Great Rising the year before. You were there, when Wat Tyler led thousands to London, demanding serfdom's end, fair laws and fewer lords calling themselves divine. You marched barefoot beside butchers and blacksmiths. You saw the royal scribes tremble, and you watched Wat Tyler die, cut down in the king's presence after a brief civil conversation. After that, it all fell apart. Your village returned to silence, but not to obedience. Now the harvest is ripe, but no one moves. You've decided as a village to wait, to let the grain over-ripen, to show what happens when those who reap simply stop. The Lord Steward pleads, offers coin, even lowers the tithe. Still the fields sway in untouched rhythm. At night, Under the full moon, you gather, quiet, calm, 100 hands doing nothing at all, a rebellion of inaction. Eventually, a priest visits, says the famine to come will be your sin. You nod, but still you wait, and when you finally harvest, it's on your terms. 3 days late, 3 sacks fewer, no explanation, just the sound of blades moving through barley and a lesson hanging in the wind. You walk a crooked path in central Switzerland, 1291. The mountains frame the horizon like jagged teeth, and below 3 men stand beneath an apple tree. You've heard whispers of this place, Rutli Meadow, where peasants from Uri, Schwyz and Unterwalden met to form a pact. The nobles had grown greedy. The Habsburgs extended their reach, demanding taxes, grain, sons for war. So the men swore an oath, not of war, not yet, but of refusal. Refusal to bow, to pay, to allow foreign judges to rule their valleys. You listen. The men speak softly, their hands rough with labour, their eyes watchful. They plant the pact like a seed, scribbled in Latin, tucked in a leather pouch. No army, no swords, just intent. Years later, it blooms into resistance. William Tell and his crossbow, cities rising in defiance, cantons federating. But tonight it's just 3 men beneath a tree. No drama, no banners, just a whisper that grows. You stand by the Thames in London, 1390. The water slaps against a moored barge and the smell of fish guts clings to the air. You remember the name, John of Colchester, a tanner, quiet, hard-working, largely unnoticed until he vanished for a year after the Peasants' Revolt. People assumed he was executed, or fled, or joined the Lollards preaching in the West. But he returned, not with weapons but with parchment. He brought back ledgers, copied from noble estates, itemized, detailed, numbers of hogs, barrels of wine, quantities of pepper. He distributed them like sermons. They showed the hoarding, the surplus, the opulence of lords who'd claimed poverty while doubling the tax rolls. The documents spread faster than sermons. People began to ask why the tax collectors wore silk and they wore patched wool. John disappeared again. But the ledgers remained, quiet revolt through information, truth in ink and dust. Some say he became a monk, others say he's buried beneath the tower. But every so often, a fresh ledger appears, unsigned, precise and very inconvenient. You lean against the soot-stained beam of a low tavern ceiling in Dijon, Burgundy, 1441. The fire crackles, the ale is sour, and the innkeeper has just said something remarkable. No silver from the Duke tonight. Everyone freezes. You glance around, merchants, farmers, a minor clerk from the bishop's office. The innkeeper repeats it. No silver stamped with the Duke's new seal. Too thin, too clipped. It doesn't buy the bread it used to. He'll take eggs, butter, grain, even credit, but not the Duke's worthless coin. It spreads quickly. Other villages here begin weighing coins before accepting them. Some melt them down and recast them into spoons. The ducal mint accuses you of counterfeiting. You laugh softly. They send an inspector. His cart breaks an axle near the village. No one helps. Eventually the Duke devalues the coin, quietly, without apology. The innkeeper never mentions it again, just pours another mug and nods politely. And you sip, knowing sometimes resistance starts in the smallest exchanges. You walk a wide plain in Saxony, 1526. The sky is pale. The battle is long over. This was Frankenhausen, where the final stand of the German Peasants' War ended. You weren't there for the slaughter, but you've heard the songs. It's said the field was full of men who limped, bent, or carried wounds from old labour. They came on crutches, not swords, with pitchforks, not banners. They followed Thomas Müntzer, a radical preacher who believed God's kingdom was to be made on earth, with justice, bread, and no nobles. He preached in the rain, baptized peasants with well water, promised the end of tyranny. You wander the edge of the field. A broken spear lies in the grass, covered in rust. Nearby, a boot, empty. The princes won. Müntzer was executed. The fields retilled. But under the soil, stories sleep. And sometimes, when you listen to the wind, you hear footsteps that limp. You run your hand along the rough wooden slats of a newly built fence on the edge of a village in Norfolk, England, 1517. The boards are still sharp with fresh carpentry, but the land it surrounds, that land used to be common. You remember when your sheep grazed here, when the children played here, when you watched the sunrise over an open field with no locks. Now it belongs to a gentleman farmer, not a lord exactly, just a man with royal favour and an interest in wool. The enclosure has come. Across England, land is being fenced, crops replaced with sheep, people replaced with profit. The government claims it's improvement. You call it exile. In one night, villagers gather, quietly, tools in hand. Posts are pulled, ropes cut, hinges hammered until they warp. The fence collapses in a soft heap of timber and indignation. By morning, it's back. And so it goes, fence up, fence down. Not a war exactly, just a disagreement with splinters. Eventually, the courts side with the landowner. You're told the fence is legal, natural, inevitable, they say. You walk the new path around it, longer and muddier, but you still glance through the slats and remember the field that once belonged to everyone. You sit in a cramped manorial office in Toulouse, France, 1372. You're not supposed to be here. The steward is gone. The clerk is asleep in a chair, his quill still damp. The ledger lies open. Pages and pages of names, debts, fines, tallies of grain, dates of arrears. Your name is there, so is your father's, and your sister, who died last winter. You light a candle, more out of habit than courage, and as the flame flickers, it leans toward the ledger. Paper curls, ink vanishes in heat. By the time the clerk stirs, the damage is done. He never blames you, he just sighs. By week's end, a new ledger arrives, neater, shorter, some debts forgotten, others forgiven. The steward complains of disorder, but for a brief moment the weight feels lighter. You return to your work, unsure if it was justice or just fire, but the room smells of wax and something unrecorded. You sit in a pew in rural Bavaria, 1452. The abbey is known for its choir, poor boys with perfect pitch and better manners. They sing each Sunday, sweet voices floating through stone vaults like smoke from candles. But today the choir is silent. Their food rations were cut last week. The abbot claimed austerity, the boys claimed hunger, and then they simply stopped. They enter the stalls, they open their mouths, and no sound comes. The congregation fidgets, the abbot turns purple. Still silence. For 4 Sundays, the abbey sounds like a tomb. No hymns, no chants, just the creak of benches and the clearing of throats. Eventually the bishop arrives, a compromise is reached. The rations improve, the music returns, but it's never quite as pure. There's something new beneath the notes now, a quiet defiance, a reminder that sometimes refusal to sing is the only protest you're allowed. You stand on the banks of the Rhône River, near Avignon, 1430. A new bridge is under construction. You're one of the builders, stonecutter, mortar mixer, part-time prayer sayer when the arches don't hold. The project is long, dangerous and unpaid. Service to the crown, the foreman says, without a hint of humour. For weeks you endure. Then a wheelbarrow disappears. Then a scaffold collapses suspiciously. Then the ropes go missing. Soon, half the workers vanish at night, only to return in the morning with excuses about sick goats and imaginary uncles. The bridge stalls, engineers arrive, orders are barked. The royal inspector falls into the river, pushed or perhaps nudged by a divine breeze. The bridge is eventually finished, barely, crooked, unstable, and for decades it's avoided by anyone with good sense. You pass it years later, its stones mossy and misaligned. They call it cursed, you know better. You know it was built on quiet rebellion and held together by nothing but reluctance. You walk once more into a village whose name doesn't matter. It could be in France, or England, or the Holy Roman Empire. The details blur like a half-remembered dream. The bell tower stands crooked. The fields are quiet. A soft rain begins. Once, this place rose up. Once, the peasants here lit torches, opened their gates, marched to the manor, and read a list of demands in shaking voices. No one remembers their names, no plaques mark the spot. The rebellion failed, swiftly, quietly, as most did, but the bell rang once, loud, clear, defiant, and though the records call it a disturbance, the village changed, just slightly. The steward never returned. The taxman came less often, the priest more humble. You pause under the tower and hear nothing, but if you close your eyes and breathe softly enough, you might still hear the echo, a single chime floating out over the damp fields. Not a victory, not a loss, just a sound that once said, "We were here."